This is our first episode of March. It's March 2nd, 2023 at 1 o'clock. And Jason and I are here to talk about the freight market roundup for this week. So Jason, how's it going? What's going on in the freight market world these days?
Woo! Oh my gosh. Okay. I've got a kid about this because I say this every single week, but oh my gosh, run another, there's just so much happening right now. And I mean, I like to kind of talk about this story often, but Anthony and me started this show way back when. Anthony was actually with this show before I was with this show. And the idea was stuff was happening that was major, it was affecting our clients and just our industry in general, all across the board. And, our teams were getting the same questions every single week. What's going on? Why is this happening? Why is it like this? So we started this as kind of a broadcast to our customers to say, hey, here's what's going on. But, it didn't get better. It kept getting worse. So we kept the show going. And what do you know? We're still not out of the weeds. So there's a lot happening. This is kind of one of those weeks where, again, we're going to feel a mile wide and an inch deep. But if you want some follow-up on any of the topics we talk about, or there's something we didn't mention, please bring it up to us. Now you can comment right on the post on LinkedIn, or obviously you can shoot Vanessa, Anthony, or myself an email. We'd love to get you in touch with some of the brains behind our operation to really help you through some of these challenges. And so anyway, it's a tough time, but as we all say, through, I don't want to call it a recession, but through adversity, you see some really brilliant ideas and some brilliant economic growth. So get excited, strap on in. Couple things here. So if you're new to this show, thank you so much for joining. We do keep a format here to keep it in order because we don't follow some slides. So just to make sure you know what's going to happen, I'm going to run through each of the major trade lanes we like to talk about on this show. It's going to start with the Trans-Pacific. We're going to move over to the Transatlantic. And then finally, we'll touch on the Suez Canal. So we'll talk about your China to Europe and kind of in between that lane as well. Between each of those sections, I'm going to talk a little bit about current events. So is Anthony. And also, it's really focused on what are our internal teams talking about and what are our customers talking about, asking about, worried about. So after we're done with that, we'll talk about air freight. We'll also talk about the oil and gas market, two really other critical things. So let's dive right in.
Yeah, and right before we dive in, we do want to let you guys know we're going to have a great show next week. Jason and I are going to be talking about a lot of the train derailments that have been occurring around our great nation, unfortunately, and how that's affecting supply chain and logistics. So definitely want to tune in for next week.
Yeah, Anthony, I am so glad you mentioned that. We are not going to talk about that much this week because there's a lot going on. Anthony and I are getting together. We're compiling everything. We're going to do the deep dive. We'll show you really what's going on compared to the norm, what could affect you and what to look out for in the future too. Anthony, thank you so much for that reminder, honestly.
Anytime. Go ahead, Jason.
So we're going to dive right in. Major trade lanes. We're starting with Southeast Asia, China region to the US West Coast. Now, when we talk about these lanes and we talk about our rates, we're looking strictly at the ocean portion. So keep that in mind, not the inland portion of the shipments. The China to West Coast lane. So as we've been talking about for weeks, and we've actually broke this down a bit by bit over the course of last year, there's just been a series of events that have made this lane less desirable for shippers. Now, there's definitely more than one nail in the coffin for this lane and the rates in this lane. But right now, I think the main thing you've got to be considering that's just kind of hanging on is this unresolved West Coast longshoreman contract negotiation. And it's just a huge risk point still for people using the LA and Long Beach ports. And when you just combine that with the general slump in demand that's been happening, you just have a little bit of a perfect storm. So it tells a little bit of the story around why the rate is so low and why it's been so low. That being said, with justification behind us, this lane is really blowing my mind. It's beyond low right now. I mean, we've seen this lane hit what's been considered the glass floor. We've seen it go below cost, and it still has been working its way down further. Right now, we're literally seeing containers, TUs, coming in for $1,000, and that's just the ocean portion. When you consider inflation into that, it's some of the lowest, if not the lowest rates this lane has ever seen. Now, if you compare just our averages, and remember, we're not looking at this week, we have to look back because we got to compile what's going on. So it's last week to the week before, we saw a 7% decrease in our rates across the board. Anthony, dive on in.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to augment what you were saying. I mean, this US Trans-Pacific eastbound rates are really back to seeing a lot of minor mitigations to most of the US gateways and inland destinations, particularly this week. And I think overall, the delays and the congestions are down, but the consistent weekly blank sailings can expect to probably remove at least 30% of the capacity from the market. So the current capacity remains above any projected container volumes, but it's still spurring a lot of recent rate reductions. And so, the rates are soft on most origin destination combinations. The space is open and the capacity and the equipment is open as well. So I think Jason and I would always want to recommend you still need to book at least 2 weeks prior to the CRD, to the cargo ready date, to keep upcoming blanks and keep the upcoming blank sailings in mind. And when you think about that Trans-Pacific eastbound market from Asia to North America, you also can't forget about Canada too, because we know a lot of our clients have stuff going into Canada, and the market and the rate conditions are similar to like the US, where Vancouver still sees stable vessel dwell counts of really only maybe 3 vessels right now waiting at the anchorage dwelling, and the berthing days are not real bad. They're berthing very quickly. So I think because of this low demand, it's really playing a key role in keeping the West Coast port and rail congestion very low. Sorry for that, Jason. I know that was a long comment.
You stop it. You stop it. This is why we do this. No, that's really, honestly, that's exactly it. And, I think you made a really good point about still making sure you're not booking at the last minute, because these ocean liners, they're not making money right now. And so they're going to look for ways to, essentially put you in a bad situation where you're paying more than you should be. So you still need to be flexible. Those blank sailings are a desperate attempt to keep the rate as high as possible, and it will affect you if you're trying to last minute book and ship. So yeah, Anthony is so on point with that. I want to also talk about, if you're shipping out of the Southeast Asia, China region, and you're going through and coming to the US East Coast ports. So, these have actually been a little bit more congested than the West Coast ports, but specifically this lane does not have the volume it used to have. So as a result, you're actually getting a very good deal for going into the East Coast ports. So right now we're looking at around $2,500 for a shipment TU, ocean shipment, coming out of the Southeast Asia, China region and going into the US East Coast ports. We've even had customers who've booked far enough in advance and kind of worked with us on flexibility, get as low as $2,200. If you think about how much longer this transit is, that is an incredible deal for going into the East Coast ports that are currently actually still dealing with some issues. So keep that in mind if you're shipping via that route. And I want to make a comment on this. So generally, these conditions would be great for contract negotiation, but you just have to remember that this is not sustainable for the ocean liners. So when you think about contract negotiation, there's a new strategy that has to be in mind. If the carrier is not going to be signing on to a deal where they're going to lose money infinitely. And in this kind of uncertain environment, it's not actually a great time. But we'll get more into that in a minute. Anthony, you want to add something?
Yeah, just one other thing, and it's something to think about as we see some of these container ship alliances start to, I don't want to say destabilize, but to break apart. For example, the 2M alliance, which was Maersk and MSC, they're going to be going it alone, after the 2M alliance ends in January 2025. Now, MSC and Maersk are big enough to stand alone, but I think it's going to be a bigger surprise in terms of what happens next as we see some of these other alliances like the Alliance and ONE. I think we're going to start to see cracks in those alliances, and that's going to change the landscape of the container shipping market a little bit. And I think as we get into this year, we're going to actually probably do a show just on that. But just something I wanted to add that, folks need to think about, that this is going to, not present a problem, but it's just something that we have to keep our finger on the pulse of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I totally agree with that. It's kind of an interesting time. MSC definitely feels like they are at the top of the world right now. They've got so much capacity coming online. They're going to be the largest single shipper for sure as soon as all that comes online. And, the alliances, we had a show talking about kind of why alliances existed in the first place. And it's actually more beneficial for a carrier to not be in an alliance than to be in an alliance. They are able to sidestep a couple regulatory problems. So MSC is kind of gonna, lead the way in the future of what's going to be happening with these shipping lines. But for the time being, some of the not as large container vessels, they're got to figure it out, right? I mean, if they can't compete, they're going to have to work their way until they can break that alliance. So it's honestly a great topic, and it's one we have to dive into deeper.
And just one more thing, Jay, before we move on, folks also need to think about, the OSRA, the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, and, that legislation went into effect last year, and there's going to be some ripple effects, and it's going to affect shippers and carriers. So people are going to start to need to make changes now as that unfolds, because, part of the OSRA is actually going to be targeting China. China's in the crosshairs in this new Ocean Shipping Reform Act, because U.S. lawmakers really want to build off of last year's regulatory overhaul, that will include more restrictions on carriers, because with China handling so much of the production and being the world's factory manufacturing, floor, I mean, it's become a national security issue now. So that's a big thing that's been going on right now, in the industry with the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. So that's another thing that could be a whole show in itself, but it's something I thought we should bring up, Jason.
Yeah, no, honestly. And that's such a good point, especially given kind of geopolitically what's going on right now. And okay, so right now it's March, and one of the things that happens in March that's pretty cool generally in a non-pandemic year is it's kind of networking season. So all these events start happening. You start to get, speakers from each of these companies coming out and talking. And right now we've got an event going on. It's TPM 23. You've got some of the ocean carriers who have individuals there speaking about what's going on, their concerns. You've got some of the largest shippers there. You've got economists. It's a good event for kind of hearing what people have been struggling about and getting people talking again, which is very important, obviously, especially in our industry. It involves, we have to rely on so many companies to make sure we can provide the best service possible. And, if you imagine everyone being siloed because of the pandemic, it makes life a little bit more challenging. But there are a lot of things that are coming out of that event specifically, and they've been kind of catching my eye. I wanted to talk about a few of them. One we kind of spoke about a little bit. So contract versus the spot market. So the general takeaway from TPM 23 right now, and one of the biggest topics that people were bringing up, was contract negotiations. And basically, the carriers are pitching this totally new idea, and it's unfortunately going to be the new norm. And it's the idea that there's no longer such a thing as a fixed true contract rate. It's only fixed as long as the overarching market forces allow it to be fixed. So the moment things change, so will pricing. And so that really changes everything from the shipper's point of view. And think about this. Many shippers now have a new equation in their head when going into a contract negotiation. So, I got a great price. Well, did you get too good of a price? Now at this point, if market factors influence it, your shipments under contracted great rates are going to be the ones left behind. And that's a really challenging situation. I mean, Anthony and me have been talking to people, and it's definitely best at this moment to be sticking with, your third-party logistics provider and have them play the spot market and not contract you at this moment. You don't want to do that. It's right now we're about 30%, I think, below contract rates. And what's going to happen going forward? I mean, these are unsustainable rates. So Anthony, I know you want to talk about it too.
What does it say about the contracts? To quote our executive vice president of international solutions, Dennis Rolls, I mean, sometimes these contracts aren't worth the paper they're even printed on anymore. So with a situation like that, it's boggles the mind. It's going to be an interesting, to see how this really plays out. So
Yeah. You remember in the beginning of the pandemic, it was the largest shippers under contract who got the
yeah,
guaranteed space and everyone else got pushed. But then as things got worse and worse, everyone was starting to get pushed. And now just that idea of your contract doesn't guarantee you the space being they're just saying this now.
yeah.
That's mind blowing. That's just
And
such
look
a
at all those folks last year that signed contracts and signed multi-year contracts, right?
Yep.
And
Around
the market
8,000.
has dropped, what, 75%, 80%, Jason? You
Exactly.
know?
And you as the shipper feel like you're on the end, you're on the losing end always now. So it's very,
Yeah,
yeah, it's challenging. It's just you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? And especially right now, especially at this moment, you really need to
yep,
wait until next year, in my opinion. And Anthony, I know that's your opinion as well, because it's just we're not out of the woods yet.
absolutely.
So one other comment I want to make from that event, and it came from the CEO of Container Trade Statistics. He was giving a talk, and he was talking about the U.S. East Coast ports, and he basically said, "Hey, the transatlantic terminals, they didn't make money before the pandemic. Now we're in this unique situation where they are making money. So what is the future, and how is this going to be sustainable for shippers?" Now, obviously, when you're thinking about that sentiment, you can't think about the rates we just discussed coming out of China, Southeast Asia, going into the U.S. East Coast ports. It's your transatlantic, right? It is your Europe to U.S. East Coast ports. Those shipments have been actually the leaders right now in the market across the major shipping lanes of the world. Now, and we'll touch on more on that in a minute, but let's quick dial it back to China for a second, because that was a huge discussion of the conference as well. So a couple things, China talking about sourcing specifically. So retired General David Petraeus, he started this topic off on one of the speeches and basically said no other country could replace China because none of them have the ability to have this colossal capacity. And they've had many decades to build that up. Now, that being said, there was a lot of talks regarding this, and a lot of the speakers commented on how this decoupling of China and the US has been taking place, and actually it indeed accelerated over the course of last year. So if we just look at 2022 data, just last year's data, China accounted for 40.7% of all US imports. Now that's actually down 1.7% from 2021. And what's interesting about this number is at 40.7%, it is the lowest it's been since 2006. So it's particularly low. I mean, that is, and it's something that, Anthony and me remember because we have sourcing partners we work with very closely, especially when rates were going skyrocketing. Getting anywhere closer was beneficial.
Yep.
And, there was two sides. One side saying, are people really resourcing? Are they really doing that? Or are they just saying they're going to? And now starting to see the data and actually having that kind of impact from all the way back to 2006, we're at that level. It just kind of shows it has been happening. And these talks have also indicated that it seems to be accelerating this year as well. So keep that in mind. Anthony, you want to mention anything before I move on?
No, I think you're very succinct as usual, and you hit the nail right on the head. And I think, just to tie that back into OSRA, I mean, it's really going to change the shipping landscape. The two big things, how will the Maersk MSC split redraw container shipping landscape, and then, how is the Ocean Shipping Reform Act going to affect shippers and importers and exporters and affect this whole relationship that we have not only with the carriers, but also with China? Because, prior to the legislation taking place last week, if container ship lines wanted to form an alliance, they could just form an alliance. Now it has to go through the Federal Maritime Commission, and it has to be signed off on. And there's a couple of more steps and hurdles that they're going to have to go through. So again, it's one of those things where we just have to really watch it week by week, keep our finger in the pulse as we do so well. But Jason, back to you. To
Yeah.
talk more about some of the market conditions. I think we were going to start to talk more about Europe to North America. I'm
Yep.
not sure though. You let us know.
Oh, you're right on. You're right on. Transatlantic. Let's talk about this. So, we've talked about this before. We just mentioned it a little bit earlier, but really that Europe to US trade lane, it's been one of the lanes that just like, if you look at the general kind of demand and how shipments have been flowing, Europe to the US East Coast, it's not been affected in the same way. And, it's just not seeing that same general downturn, at least to the same magnitude that other lanes are. So just looking at our compiled rate averages as of last week, right now we're right under $5,000 for our average. But I think something to note about this lane is it's been kind of rocky. There has been a slight decrease over the past few months. But if you go back to the second week in December, it was around $6,000. So we're about $1,000 per TEU cheaper. And if you compare this to prior to the pandemic, that was when rates were around 2,000, 2,500 per TEU. So we're still well above those initial rates. We did see rates, I want to say around 3 weeks ago, I think we saw a low point at around 4,400 a TEU. So it's slightly up again, but the general trend has been going downward. And I think that's kind of something to keep in mind.
Yeah. And just real quick, I mean, as Jason said, this transatlantic westbound rate is not just from Europe to North America. We also have to think of Canada again, because we know a lot of our viewers also are working in the Canadian market as well. And, Hagpag Lloyd, I read a great article over the weekend. They're going to be dropping in a bunch more vessel capacity into Northern Europe to Canada to that service. So that's probably going to drive down rates a little bit more. But, really the story is that the drop continues as demand is not picking up at the same pace as last year. And vessel utilization right now is about 65 to 70% range, down from 90% just a few months ago. So, even though we have easing congestion and space is available on the U.S. East Coast and the U.S. West Coast, we still see some pricing falling, and capacity is fine. There's plenty of equipment availability right now as the congestion disappears, and the low empty stacks at the inland depots are also getting better in some areas, but they still are prioritizing pickup from the port of loading as quickly as possible. So again, you still want to book 2 to 3 weeks out from the cargo ready date. And, if you don't want to be rolled, request a premium service for a higher reliability. Even though congestion's down, container ship lines can be finicky. And if they can, it doesn't make a difference what your contract says. If they can load a container at a higher revenue for them, they're probably going to take the higher revenue container. So just something I wanted to throw out there. Jason, go ahead, back to you. I think I know we're going to hit India subcontinent and North America now.
Well, first, I want to talk about a couple other things, and I want to quick shamelessly plug our partner. So we've got a German consolidation partner, LLS. If you're with us on last week's show, we were talking mainly about their air consol, but we also do a very integrated partnership on an ocean consol as well. So if you're shipping a couple containers a month, it would be a great time to check out this weekly consolidation. And the goal of that project is to make it a reliable cost that you can plan on. Also, as reliable as possible schedule, so you know when it's shipping, and we have the least amount of people touching the goods. So the idea is we're packing it, we're ensuring it's packed and blocked and braced properly. They're packing it, we're unpacking it. And as a result, if there's any customs issues, there's less people to communicate with, so we can kind of manage that. Obviously, with consolidations, we had a commenter that made a really great point. Big problem with consolidations is, you're beholden to anybody who gets flagged by customs in your container, but less people involved, and we communicate highly with each of those customers, so we can kind of resolve those as fast as possible if they occur. Hey, Anthony, I know you just mentioned it, but since we both had the LLS last week, you want to say anything else that I might have missed on that before I move on?
No, the LLS program is a tremendous program with biweekly consolidations. We can pick up in Germany and some of the surrounding EU countries by as late as 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday or on a Friday. Flights are Wednesdays and Saturdays, getting in on Thursdays, getting in on Sundays. We're able to deliver on a Monday or a Friday. We also have ocean freight consolidations going into Norfolk. In addition to Chicago. So it's a great program. You really need to reach out to Jason and I to get more information on it and take advantage of it, because there's a lot of dense freight in these consolidations, and some of that lighter freight gets to enjoy that density rate and really fly at a cheaper rate. So that is just a tremendous program. But I think going back to Jason, I know we want to talk about India subcontinent.
One more thing on East Coast. I know I keep diving
Sure.
back into it. So we do have some news happening on the East Coast right now. It is the West Coast labor talks are now spreading to the East Coast. This is happening right now, and it's early. So obviously, it's been not a fun process with the West Coast labor talks, but we also had a lot of other events happen during that, and obviously some of the some of the negotiation tactics went against shippers a little bit. But now we've got that happening a year early on the East Coast. And, what's happening is union locals, they represent the dock workers at 36 of the ports. These ports include basically go Maine all the way down to Texas, and they've opened up their contract talks. Now, obviously, the key thing is these are way early. Now, obviously the ports have started to kind of communicate about this, and some of the officials, and the general idea is, hey, it's a tight time for labor and they want to start early. Now, Anthony and me, having watched this market closely for a couple of years, we know this bit of demand that we're experiencing right now on the East Coast has a limited period of time. And so it's my bet they're trying to get these talks happening while they still have these labor restrictions, while we still have demand to work with, and while it's imbalanced, to get the most out of the deal that they can. So it's unfortunately, I hope we can wrap up the West Coast talks fast enough to give shippers an option. But there's still is a lot of other benefits to the East Coast that if we do go into some dark days of these talks, that shippers won't be able to enjoy, which is unfortunate. Now,
Well said. Well said. Go ahead, Jason.
Thank you. And then let me quick see here. So a couple other things that we've got happening into the East Coast are we've got a couple new services that just got introduced as well. And, obviously with these talks, a fantastic time, kind of pumping up that volume, pumping up the labor need. So Gold Star Line, they announced a new new weekly service. And this is going to be connecting Indonesia to major Southeast Asia ports to the US East Coast. So that's brand new. That started at the beginning of this month. It has actually been going pretty well. And then also there is another service that was just introduced. It is on Zim, and it is coming from the South American West Coast and going to the US East Coast. So we are kind of seeing some of these new sourcing options and sourcing locations needing actually service and needing a official trade lane. And that is happening. And the East Coast is benefiting from that right now. Anthony, from the India lane standpoint, I don't have a rate that I was going to discuss. If you've got something on the India standpoint, you are welcome to jump in on that.
Yeah, just that in terms of right now out of India, basically for most of the base ports, especially if it's in Nava Sheva or Mundra, we're looking right now, going into the East Coast at about $2,050 for a 20-foot container and about $2,900 for a 40 and a 40-foot high cube. I know we're coming up on our hard stop that we have today, but we are seeing rates reduced in the second half of February and into March. But the expectation is that the stabilization will occur as we head into March for that India subcontinent into North America. The rates have decreased week over week. Space is open. Capacity is open. There's very limited blank sailings. There's not a lot of disruptions, which is, totally different than how this was a year ago coming out of India. So I think our only recommendation is to be open to procuring equipment from some of the wet ports versus the inland container depots in India, because they are having some equipment issues and repositioning equipment in containers in India. So when they say wet ports, it's better to try to get your equipment right in the port vicinity versus having to go inland where the equipment is a little bit more scarcer. But that's Indian subcontinent. I know we're just about out of time today, I believe, but I do want to just mention one thing. Jason and I are going to try to give such a shout out to some of our loyal listeners and followers, and we want to give a shout out this week to one of our most loyal followers and partners, Mr. Bill Stechabar from Gourmet International. They're a tremendous company based in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We've had the pleasure of working with them over these last several years, and it's been an amazing partnership. So I'd been remiss if I didn't give a shout out to Bill and to Mike Nitschke at Gourmet International.
I have to completely second that. You guys have been absolute super fans, and it definitely makes us smile after the show. Vanessa, it's up to you. We got a couple more rates we can run through, and you can turn them into clips, or we can. It's totally up to you because I know we are running over.
Hey, take your time. I'll give you 10 more minutes.
All right.
Perfect. Let's go. Okay. Extended edition. All right, let's quick talk about our China to Europe lane, because this has been a very interesting spot. So I want to quick take a step back, set the table a little bit. So obviously there's been a lot of talk surrounding this lane lately, and it's really because China started just increasing the number of shipments that are headed to Russia, and obviously those shipments are going to Russia versus its European partners. But one thing that's very fascinating about this lane is a lot of those shipments, obviously this is a little bit land-based, but they've been using the Silk Road rail system in comparison. Now, if you do a cost by cost analysis of shipping via ocean versus shipping via this rail system, unfortunately, it's actually a lot more expensive to ship via this rail system. And there's about 5 times the volume that they normally ship on this rail system, currently going on this rail system to Russia. Now, this has definitely affected the volatility of this lane. I always used to tease about Old Faithful and the global shipping barometer being this lane. That is not the case anymore. And what we're looking at right now is our rates are coming in at around 2,500, and that's down from about 3,000 at the beginning of this month. But quite frankly, there is not a good trend going on here. I mean, if you look at the rate averages, it looks like a scatter plot full of outliers. So we have a very small and short-term trend going on that could continue, especially given some of the events that have happened. But one thing I do want to mention, we've got a few really fun shows coming up, and Anthony's mentioned one that we're going to be doing. We also have next week's the rail derailment shows, but we're also going to be diving into the Russia and China relationship, because there has been a lot of changes in how shipping has been occurring, and who's supplying who. And I think it's important to understand this from a business risk perspective. I wouldn't immediately jump at some of these, increases in volume happening there, because Russia and China have a very long history. They're very close partners. They've always been very close partners. So it's not particularly shocking, but it is important to be watching this situation and understand, how you may be affected if, something occurs. So there is that. Anthony, you want to add to that before I jump into air?
No, please go ahead, Jay.
Cool. All right, air freight. Let's dive into it. So if you are shipping from the Asian air market and you're coming into the US market, North American US market, you should expect to pay right now, at least as of our rate averages last week, around $4.35 a kilo. And that's actually slightly up from the all-time lowest pricing we've seen. And I want to kind of quick put a little, kind of a timestamp on that. For about the past year, it was actually normally above $4 a kilo, and we dipped below $4 a kilo a couple of weeks ago. But it's still right above that point. What we've got going on in the next few months is generally there's a lot of consumer electronics that start being released. And a lot of those parts generally come out of the Southeast Asia, China region. So, and a lot of those parts are also air shipped. So if you do have an air shipment that is maybe you're considering shipping at some point, you should try to get it booked as soon as possible, because these lower than normal rates probably won't be lasting for that much longer. Now, if we move over to Europe, so European shipments coming to the US, we already shamelessly plugged our partner LLS, but do consider our consolidation. It is a fantastic program. But if you are shipping just regular, what our customers are paying for just buying air freight out of the consolidation is right around the $2.86 a kilo point right now. Actually, that was pretty. And the thing about Europe to US is the rates are actually very stable. There's a lot of capacity flying. And so just as a result, you don't see some of the same seesawing effect that you see in the China, Southeast Asia to US region.
Yeah, and Jay, one thing I want to say about that Europe air freight is that, as you mentioned, the overall demand has increased with a few little fluctuations in the rates week over week across point pairs in the air freight market. But currently, I think some of the direct routings have a longer lead time and higher rates. And I think, more indirect options are available with one or more connections at a cheaper rate, but with a slightly longer transit time. So that's something to think about when you're booking your air freights. If you're not able to put your freight into our EU Germany consolidation on a weekly, bi-weekly basis, you might want to think about some of the more indirect routings on air freight that are going to be cheaper but have a longer transit time. But essentially, even though the demand is increasing in Europe, there's really no major disruptions or delays across the major hubs from what I've seen.
And you're totally right when you talk about that consolidation again, because it is really the air freight consolidation is the we love the container consolidation, but the air freight one is the one we've got down to a science. We've got the multiple different options for shipping, and we're spot on with our delivery dates. We've even got a customer who is a high volume air shipper who, generally speaking, would just go buy his own space in the plane because he would get a better deal. And that's a rare circumstance. But he chooses to go with us just because it's extremely reliable for him. He doesn't have to worry about it. It's over the weekend. He knows exactly when it's going to be delivered. And he's many miles actually from our consolidation point. We've just got it all linked together pretty nicely. So let's move on. So let's move on to the Central and South America. So if you're shipping Central South America to US, expect to pay right under $3 a kilo. And what's happening right now over the past few weeks, this rate sort of hit its low point, does seem to be inching up right now, but still looking at the grand scheme of things in this lane, this is actually a great deal for this lane. There is the recession and the global kind of slump in demand is affecting also Central and South America. So there is an opportunity still to capitalize on these slightly lower rates. So if you do have a shipment that you need to ship air, definitely book as soon as possible. There's seems to be a slight trend of it moving upwards. Now,
go ahead, Jason. I'm sorry.
No, you go for it. You go for it.
No, I was just going to say, when we talk about the Americas, we do see export demand remaining steady from all the markets. And, most of the US airports are running at a normal pace. Capacity is opening up further, especially in the Europe from the Americas. And the rates really remain stable week over week. And even all through the pandemic, the Americas is one of those areas where things were fairly stable. So, back to you, Jason.
Yeah, our Central and South American expert in-house is he gives us a great weekly update on what's going on, and he's been echoing that for us. And so that's kind of good to hear, especially because we do have a decent amount of Central and South American customers. So I want to end on a good note, oil and gas, which has not generally been a good note for the past year. But honestly, prices have been looking a lot better and just really week over week better. So one of the things I want to talk about is don't let your carriers complain too much about these high fuel prices, because they've been on a downward trend since October. And across the US week over week right now, we're looking at around $4.29 a gallon. It's 8 cents down from last week. And, this is basically always the winner across the US and the lowest diesel prices. But PAD 3, it's a petroleum region, petroleum I'll break down that acronym later. I forgot to jot it down in my notes. I always forget it. But PAD 3, it's basically your Gulf region, not including Florida. And but they've been flirting with under $4 a gallon for diesel. So this is pretty cool. Now, we did just hit our anniversary of the fuel apocalypse, which basically happened right after the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And, fuel has been looking great, but we have to remember it's still 19 cents a gallon higher than it was this time last year. So still has some room to fall if it will fall more. But yeah, no, seriously, clear downward trend since October. So keep that in mind. And that's what we got.
Well, guys, we really appreciate you listening to Jason and I yap away like we do every week. Don't forget to tune in next week. We're going to have a tremendous show about all this rail disruption and these accidents. And it's very unfortunate and very tragic. There was just a big derailment last Saturday on the BNSF railroad out of New Mexico. And unfortunately, we had a few clients that were on that rail. So we're going to have a great show next week. It's going to be a key show of the year. So don't forget to tune in. And thanks for being so loyal to the weekly Ship Show series. We're your go-to people for everything about supply chain.
Make it a great week. Anthony, if you don't say that, I have a depressing rest of the day.
Make it a great day. And again, shout out to Bill Stetchbar. I promised him. Take care, guys.